thank you for the invitation to speak this evening. My name is Rowena Burgess. I'm Associate Professor at the University of East Anglia. I actually work in what is called, a very long title, the Interdisciplinary Institute for the Humanities, but I'm a historian by training, and I teach a number of modules in that department. So what do we think of then when we think of crime and punishment in the past? Does it suggest to you the death sentence? Does it suggest transportation, or maybe more small-scale crime, poaching, illegal gambling? What I'm going to talk to you this evening is about the background to some of these different types of crimes that were prevalent in the 18th and 19th century in Britain, their origins, and how the changes to punishment have evolved over the period that we're talking about. I think it's important to remember that rural workers, and on the whole, I'm talking broadly Norfolk and Suffolk, were not passive victims of change, but adopt a range of strategies from wood taking, poaching, incendiarism, and more structured protests such as Chartism to voice their opposition and to oppose change. We'll consider everyday practices, food shortage, lack of money, poverty, which influence rural counties and the effects it has on and making the society that we're familiar with today. So Suffolk is blessed with a number of observers and commentators when it comes to the period from the mid-18th century onwards. From Crabbe, the example on your screens, through to Constable, from Gainsborough through to Fitzgerald. They endeavoured to show us what the county was like in a way that statistics would struggle to do. So for Lowestoft, we're not just going to think about the growth in tourism, the growth as the harbour and its growth towards the end of the 19th century, but we're going to consider its working population, and particularly that on the east coast in Suffolk and Norfolk, and their opportunities and protests against change. I usually use this image, and I actually kept this image in because this is the A146 actually, so that links I am in South Norfolk talking to you this evening, but it's a really good illustration of a rural landscape. This image is taken from the Castle Museum, but you can see the windmill, you can see the town of Loddon on the horizon, but the people moving slowly along what is a very unmade up road, and the farming community alongside that road. The term agricultural revolution has been used in connection with events at various times in the past, when significant change in agricultural practice led to new ways of working. However, it is probably linked most closely to agricultural change between the 17th and the 19th century, which not only enabled English farmers to produce more food, but to do so without a commensurate increase in the number of people working on the land, or increasing the actual amount of land that was under production. But the labour force, and in particular the agricultural working man, was increasingly subject to the pressures exerted by this change. An image here giving you Corton, so close to Lowestoft, but just showing obviously the same very rural environment that people were living in the 18th and 19th century. So the labourer and worker is not an owner-occupier, but increasingly of employed status. The later 18th century sees the main period of enclosure, as defined as reorganisation of land into compact farms, removing of open fields, and much of what was characteristic of an earlier period. But this led to a removal of common rights and reorganisation at a parish level of farming structure. Rural workers become more dependent on the landed elite, not just for employment, but also for housing. And as such, the balance of power changes. There is also an increasing disconnect between farmer and worker. the decline in custom of living in, so when labourers were living in the farmhouse with the farmer, and the rise of a landless labourer without access to any land, with low wages and very basic living conditions. From 1793 to 1815, England was almost continuously involved with war in France. Fluctuating prices of food, a run of poor harvests. There are only 2 good harvests and 14 poor ones in 22 years. And the need to supply men for the army and navy, and eventually, when men returned, their support, all added to some of these divisions between landed and worker. Continental blockades increased the need for food from British soil, and obviously both Norfolk and Suffolk could respond to this. But this period was hard on coastal communities in particular, such as Yarmouth and Lowestoft, where press gangs were active. In theory, no ship in harbour could be manned until the Navy's requirements were met. And although fishermen were in theory exempt, some were pressed into service. So from even these earlier stages, protest is not unusual. Workers subject to patterns of trade and periods of dearth, the rise in prices and harvest failures. Land ownership is very clearly defined. There is the concept of absolute and hereditary property is fully defined and realised. Rights are transferred from one party to another, and the idea of ownership, and maybe more importantly, non-ownership, is quite clear to the landed and those who are the workers. The possession of land, both its ownership and its practical development through tenancy, gave more power and authority in the countryside. Larger estates, often managed by an agent, commonly referred to as a steward or a bailiff, and land was often leased to tenants. The dominance of society by the landed gentry, the development of fashionable farming, for which Norfolk and Suffolk were also quite well known, led to an increase in shooting and hunting, but more importantly, the need to protect property. This led to an ever-increasing division between the classes, even before the fears generated by the French Revolution and the subsequent wars with France. So what I want to do is think about the crime and law in these 3 main areas. Firstly, the use of law and political protest. Secondly, the use of law against customary practice. And thirdly, the use of law to gather revenue. So first, the use of law and political protest and political interest. And by that, I mean the division more between landed and non-landed members of society. The importance of forest and woodland as both playgrounds for the rich and wealthy and as part of a community are well established. In fact, a House of Lords committee in 1698 considered abuses of these areas, such as wood taking by local populations, particularly deer hunting, and the destruction of land for building. The conclusions suggested by this committee included the need to limit these abuses, but also to make this land financially viable for its owners. One of the first recorded instances is activities of the blacks. Blacks because their faces were often blackened and camouflaged. The action of the Windsor blacks, which occur in the mid-18th century, as well as those that happen in Waltham Forest, were seen as a crisis which needed to be dealt with. The outcome is the restoration of the 1485 Hunting and Forest Act, with a £100 reward for anyone either discovering or apprehending an individual. What's important about this piece of legislation and where we start our story is that all activities, those we've just outlined, were punishable by death. Although the protests of the blacks were very much confined to the southeast, the legislation was applicable nationwide. It was used to protect the landowners' interests in forest and other land that may have been seen as less commercially of interest. But it's often cited by historians as the government's first attempt to protect property by law, the start of the protection of property for the landed classes. So although the Black Act in 1723 was not deployed regularly, it's the start of a process which has expanded throughout the 18th century, including something you may be more familiar with, which was the introduction of the Riot Act in 1715. The Act created a mechanism for officials to make a proclamation ordering the dispersal of any group of more than 12 people. If the group failed to disperse within 1 hour of the reading, then anyone remaining gathered was guilty of a felony that was also punishable by death. Hence where we get the phrase to read the Riot Act. And this act was not actually repealed until 1967. Sir Samuel Romilly, speaking to the House of Commons on capital punishment at the start of the 19th century, declared there is no country on the face of the earth in which there have been so many different offences according to law that are punishable by death. At its height, the criminal law included 220 crimes punishable by death, from shoplifting through to stealing sheep, cattle, or horses. So while executions for murder, burglary, and robbery were more common, the death sentence for minor offences was often not carried out. A sentence of death could be commuted for reasons such as official pardons, pregnancy of the offender, or performance of military duty. So between 1770 and 1830, an estimated 35,000 death sentences were handed down, but only around 7,000 of those were actually carried out. The death penalty was mandatory, could only be commuted by the Home Secretary, until the Judgment of Death Act in 1823, when judges were given the power to commute the death penalty, except in the case of murder. The Punishment of Death Act in 1832 reduced the number of capital crimes by 2/3 and abolished death penalty for things such as counterfeiting, for forgery. Gibbeting was abolished in 1832, hanging in chains in 1834, and 1837 the death penalty for forging wills. The death penalty for rape was abolished in 1841. So by the time we get to 1861, several acts of parliament have reduced further the number of capital punishments. And we are really then looking at approximately 5. That is murder, treason, espionage, arson in a royal dockyard, and piracy. So the death penalty remains mandatory for treason and murder, and that could only be commuted by the monarch by this point in time. So we see a huge change from where we started with the blacks through to the middle of the 19th century and the range of punishments, range of offences punishable with the death penalty. The proposal, or a Royal Commission on Capital Punishment in 1866 concluded not the need to abolish the death penalty, but to recommend the end of public executions. Griffin has suggested that up to 90% of those convicted after the early 19th century, so around 1815 onwards, up to 90% of them were commuted, so they weren't actually carried out. Although a number are still remaining as a death penalty on the books, so to speak. But why the change? And this is where we start to think about this in the local context. Transportation was originally seen as an alternative to the death penalty, and therefore applied to the more serious crimes, including arson and robbery. And sometimes murderers who were reprieved from hanging were also transported. But not just for the reasons of transportation of criminals. The colonies were often situated in frontier lands, and many prisoners were unpaid labour that could be useful in the times before there's wide-scale immigration. Some people were sentenced to trivial or dubious offences to generate this cheap labour. I'm going to show you a couple of examples here. So the top one from Loddon, two gentlemen breaking into a workshop, stealing 8 watches and then passing them to William Bennett. Moss and Gurney were both transported for life and Bennett for 7 years. And the example there of James Gregson, a mariner, resident of Lowestoft, convicted for stealing 2 pieces of lace, found guilty and sentenced to 14 years transportation. He left Portsmouth in 1838. It was transported to Tasmania, and I'm just going to show you the next screen. So apologies that the print is very small, but when you arrived in Tasmania or Australia, you were continued to be monitored, as you would expect. And our friend Gregson was not particularly well behaved. He absconded. He didn't remain where he should do a lot of times. And this is his record. And you can see the number of times that he's written in the book that he's absconded. They had to recapture him and put him back to work. He actually died in 1850, so before the end of his sentence. But there's a huge amount of records for those who are interested. The Australian government have spent a lot of time digitising a lot of this material, as you can see, and the websites are available for people who are interested in looking either for individuals, but also obviously particular types of crimes. Although there's no process or procedure for returning after your sentence has expired, prisoners very rarely came back to Britain, despite the varying lengths of the sentences that could be applied, as we saw in the examples there. In the 1830s, anti-transportation champion Sir William Molesworth, a member of the House of Commons Select Committee, concluded it did not work to deter crime and should be abolished in favour of gang labour on public works. And in fact, by this time, the middle of the 19th century, many of the colonial areas were refusing to accept convicts as they had a supply of labourers coming from the UK voluntarily. Transportation had also become very expensive, and so the government looks for cheaper solutions. Although in 1853, only long-term transportation was retained by Act of Parliament, it was actually abolished in 1857, but the last transportations did take place up until 1868. So if we think about the use of law against customary practice, so things that perhaps you're more familiar with and maybe have a more romantic image in the rural population, that of poaching and wood taking. Beyond the thought of taking an injured bird, the process of poaching does actually require a little bit of equipment and a little bit of planning. If we consider that poaching was not an entirely opportunistic crime, then we must also consider it was not simply undertaken by those who wished to feed families, but also those as part of gang and with organised crime in mind. So you can see that for historians, poaching has been something that is quite interesting to study and to look at, but it is obviously quite complicated. The first Game Act is introduced in 1671 and provides further evidence that game was not free for all. A further act in 1831 tightens the description and introduces what we're more familiar with as a closed season. The privatisation of common ground and common rights can be seen as part of this movement from customary rights through to the option of crime and the legislation that surrounds it. There is, though, a distinction between law and practice. The work of Osborne in Suffolk and Archer in Lancashire have highlighted the organised nature of much poaching. In fact, rising sporting occupations for the landed elite gave a rise to increased opportunity as more game was raised and therefore more game released within a locality. William Cobbett noted that landowners were often as interested in the game on their land as they were the crops in the field. But I think poaching is an index to increasing poverty and social tension, and Suffolk reflects this. For riots which undertook between 1817 and 1818, Suffolk ranked 10th as a county for convictions. It was 5th in 1819, it became 3rd in convictions in 1827, and was 2nd in 1829 and 30. So the increasing number of convictions around rioting. One of the things that rioting is an indication to us is of poverty and social unrest. The Royal Commission, considering the role of the Poor Law prior to its introduction in 1834, asked questions about disturbances in 1830 and specifically the causes. For Suffolk, 12 were due to low wages, 17 to unemployment, 4 to poor law, and only 4 were due to individual revenge situations. Though I like the fact that a separate category, 8, were caused by beer shop fights escalating. A survey in Norfolk and Suffolk in the mid-1830s also discovered that a third of an family's income was derived from the wife or woman and children. So family income, the male breadwinner plus the rest of the family, are all required in order to provide sufficient income. And we can illustrate this where we're thinking about the game laws with these convictions over quite a short period of time between 1829 and 1832, but you can see how high the number of convictions are in Suffolk in those two periods. I've put a couple of other counties on that graph just to indicate to you that it's the importance, or maybe not importance, but the numbers involved in Norfolk and Suffolk in comparison with other rural counties at the same time period. So the other thing I wanted to think about is using the law to gather revenue, and in particular smuggling. And smuggling being something that in a coastal county and in Lowestoft and Yarmouth in particular would be something that would be more familiar to the rural community. The first Board of Custom was introduced in 1643 and acted as the first encouragement to bring in goods with duty attached. The occupation, that is smuggling, certainly requires capital, both for boats and outlay. So in the same way that we talk about game requiring a little bit of premeditation, obviously smuggling requires even more. The study of smuggling has not been covered by historians in quite the same way as the game laws have. But we know from the Smuggling Act in 1746 that the running of goods became a capital offence, revised again in 1779. And it's been estimated that by the 1740s, 70% of the tea being drunk was smuggled. However, there was increasing evidence of rising violence against both officials and informers, which led to an increasing crackdown on their activities from the mid-18th century. In 1749, for example, 5 smugglers were found guilty and executed within a month at Chichester. And further trials take place both at the Old Bailey and in Kent in Sussex, leading to execution of another 20 individuals. Certainly what helps is a reduction in the duty on tea from 127% down to 12.5%, which reduces the value of tea as a smuggled commodity. But obviously, alcohol and other revenue streams take their place. The predecessor of the modern Coast Guard, it was established in 1809, called the Water Guard, and was originally devoted to the prevention of smuggling as a department of customs and excise. The creation of a coastal blockade and Coast Guard system signals a new approach to the problem. And this extract is taken from a diary from one of those new coastal guards, whose jobs were to watch the coastline, not for what activity is going on out at sea, but for what's happening along the coastline itself. And you can see them observing a number along the Devon coastline in this example. So while we might see the role of poaching and smuggling and other forms as an indication of the state's increasing role in protecting private property, in addition, we see these activities as a statement of rural society's role and the changing nature of the state and society. We have considered the role of law in framing of protests, but what about the economy? The 19th century bears witness to a high number of food riots. In fact, it's been suggested 2 out of every 3 can be seen to be attributed to food supply. The riots, however, could take different forms. They could impose a price on a supplier, and they might not necessarily be about a lack of food, but sometimes about a rapid or unexplained price rise. I think the importance for our consideration lies in the changing attitude to those protesters, which are symbolised by the food riots, and increasingly movement of magistrates from one of negotiation to one of suppression. For rural workers, the decreased access to food and the changes we've already seen to the agricultural economy with wage levels and poor relief work together to be the first focus of protest, which particularly becomes more intense as we start the 19th century. Firstly, there tends to be groups of individuals starting to make protests rather than individuals, and they start to target officials rather than maybe property. So in particular, those who might be administering poor relief, or for clergy, or for individuals, parish officials who take part in something that interacts with the access that these individuals have to food or income. But what I want to consider first is arson as a form of activity. During the night of the 10th of September 1756, a mill at Oakhampton in Devon was set on fire. The sound of the walls cracking in the surrounding cottages alerted the sleeping residents to the fact of the fire, and the residents were close to perishing in the flames. This was recorded and reported by the Sherborne and Yeovil Mercury, who were confident this was a case of arson. 4 months later, a similar fire broke out in mills in Botley in Hampshire, and another in the early hours of the 23rd of January, when a miller's property was completely destroyed, including all his flour. Now, the cause for some of these is not clear, but the inference from these early reports is that they were not accidents, but that they were deliberately cases of arson. But they're the indication to us of the first positive period where individuals, a miller or farmers or dealers, were being attacked directly in relation to food and to the provision of flour, obviously, in the case of the mills. Arson was an important tool in forcing the economy. The fire and the fear of fire was readily referred to and undertaken. Jones, in his study of East Anglia in the 1840s, records 671 committals for incendiarism to the Assizes Court. In addition, the press and the elites were increasingly preoccupied with these events. You can imagine in a period where there is less access to the prevention of fire and to actually treating fire, that fear of fire, not just fire itself, is a really important consideration. Though the peak of these attacks is often seen in a period referred to as swing, which we'll come back to in a moment, farmers were clearly the main targets. There is some evidence that farms were started for insurance purposes, and arson is not the only protest that we see in the early 19th century. The image on the screen at the moment is one that's typically used to illustrate Luddites. So Luddites are traditionally defined as machine breakers, possibly more associated in an urban than a rural context. But they are the start of this period of increased activity in terms of unrest and protest across the country. Luddites protests traditionally are seen as starting in 1811 in Nottinghamshire in the hosiery trade, and then moving more directly into Derbyshire and then Leicestershire before moving into Lancashire on a much larger scale. Between March 1811 and February 1812, around 1,000 machines at the cost of between £6,000 and £10,000 are destroyed in this period of Luddite activity. And in April 1812, the Luddites attacked William Cartwright's mill near Huddersfield, and that's an example, one that's described by Charlotte Bronte in her novel Shirley. Cartwright and a few soldiers held the mill against 150 attackers, 2 of whom were killed. The often brutal repression of the disturbances in Lancashire and Yorkshire effectively led to the end of this type of machine breaking in the textile trade. But it does turn our attention to what was more common in this part of the country, and that's machine breaking in the agricultural industry. The arrival of what historians have termed swing riots can be seen in part as an evolution of these disturbances that we've just referred to. Probably exacerbated by long-term issues between farmers, the payment of tithes, and the association of levels of poor or low wages. A series of coordinated attacks on threshing machines in and around Elmon Valley in Kent proved to be rather more influential and been studied by a large number of historians. The first recorded attack occurred at a village called Wingmore, which is near the village of Barham, and 20 men on the 21st of August 1830. So what we now refer to as the swing riots start at a very small scale in a part of the country, obviously, that is not ours. However, I'm just going to show you a map here, which shows the number of disturbances that take place over the next 6 to 9 months. You can see that Norfolk and Suffolk do have a large number of disturbances. There's an advert there as a reward for swing. Historians are not entirely sure why the word swing, so a number of anonymous letters are sent at this time, signed swing. I'm not entirely sure whether that's due to the thought that you would swing, as in capital punishment, if you were caught, or whether there was another reason for using that title. And this is just some examples of some of the activity that's happening around Lowestoft at this point in time. So you can see arson attacks, North Cove. Interestingly, North Cove one, when it's reported in the press, the farmer was not, or the tenant was not insured. So the farm does not belong to James Lemming. He was the tenant. And then you can see a number of riots going on around wages and tithes. And I guess the connection that if tithes were lower, the labourers believed that their wages would be higher. And then another fire attack at Goose Green, just outside Beccles, towards the end of 1730. So these are the number of disturbances where we have evidence as to the reasons, and actually what they were focusing on. So you can see arson was actually really popular in Norfolk. whereas riots, activity under wages was more popular in Suffolk. Machine breaking, very common in Norfolk, less common actually in Suffolk, but then proportionally that's less activity going on in Suffolk at this point in time. But just so you can see what happens as far as the trials are concerned, and these are people who were brought to trial for this activity in the 1830. Many more cases in Norfolk, but sentence even goes down to sentence to death, although no one was executed from Suffolk, only one in Norfolk, but you can see quite a few were transported. One such example is John Hart, who was born in Debenham in Suffolk and was a shoemaker. He was caught red-handed destroying a threshing machine belonging to a farmer, Robert Campion. Within 3 days of that, in December 1830, he was charged, found guilty, and sentenced to 7 years transportation. He was transported on the Eliza, along with 7 other people from Suffolk, departing the UK on the 6th of February 1831 and arriving in Hobart on the 29th of May 1831. His time at Circular Head was not an easy one. He was reprimanded, lashed, fined for offences which included being away from his hut after hours, neglecting his duty, disobeying orders, being drunk and disorderly, and entering the shoemaker's hut after hours. Interestingly, all of these transported under the swing riots were actually pardoned. So he was pardoned on the 3rd of February 1836, but didn't return, as most of them did not. As you saw on the earlier slide, only one person was executed in Norfolk and Suffolk, and that was one Richard Knockolds. For those who are familiar with Norwich, you may recognise the church in this image. It's now the Puppet Theatre, so the area around it looks very different, obviously. But he was buried in this churchyard, which I think is now underneath Barclays Bank. But what's interesting also about this gentleman is he is one of the last people to be returned to a family after he was executed. After that, in Norwich Castle, they were buried within the grounds of the castle. So he was somebody who was given back to his family. And actually, arson as a capital offence was abolished in 1836. So those who were executed for arson after the swing riots, it's the very end of the period, that arson was a capital offence. The question is, was it effective? In some areas, certainly, threshing machines are delayed in their introduction by around 10 years. And perhaps what's most interesting is that against the backdrop of the end of the French wars, the death of George IV and political reform, much of this activity is not reported in the mainstream British press until much later the following year. By the end of the year, so that's 1831, there have been 1,976 trials, 252 people were sentenced to death, but 233 of those had their sentence commuted to life transportation. So only 19 across the country were executed, as you can see. 800 actually of those trials, the individuals were acquitted or bound over. The other area of political protests that you may be more familiar with are the Tolpuddle Martyrs, who are also part of this period of protest. A group of farm labourers in 1833 who met in the village of Tolpuddle, which is in Dorset, having seen their already low wages of 9 shillings cut to 7 shillings, threatened with a further reduction, decided to form a friendly society of agricultural labourers. Led by George Lovelace, a Methodist lay preacher, a preliminary meeting was arranged, followed by, on the 9th of December, an invitation, a sort of ceremony to establish their trade unions and that they would swear by a number of rules. In 1834, James Frampton, a local landowner and magistrate, wrote to the Home Secretary to complain about the union. The men were arrested and tried and found guilty and transported to Australia. They also became quite popular heroes, and there was a petition set up in order to pardon them. They were also pardoned in March 1836, so at the same point in time. The swing rioters are pardoned. And actually, the Tolpuddle martyrs are more unusual in that they did return to the UK. So we've talked a little bit about crime and punishment. I just want to think just briefly about the response to this in terms of policing. The Municipal Corporations Act of 1835 allowed borough councils to organise a police force. By 1837, 93 out of 171 boroughs had done so. The Rural Constabulary Act of 1839 allowed for the 54 English counties to have a paid police force, and allowed JPs to appoint chief constables, and allowed for one policeman per 1,000 of the population. By 1848, there's still 22 boroughs that do not have a police force, and in 1850, only 36 counties did. Interestingly, Norfolk and Suffolk do not appear in that they established their police forces. East Suffolk in 1840 and West Suffolk in 1845, and Norfolk in 1839. So they do respond to the legislation quicker than some parts of the country. But the implementation was slow. And you can see some of the reasons why on the slide on the screen. The challenge to individual freedom and questioning both the cost of and the need for a police force. The enforcement of some legislation, which was obviously unpopular with the population, and the cost of running such a police force. All these things, I guess, are probably not surprising, and reasons that some parts of the country were particularly slow in establishing a police force. It's not actually until 1856 that the Police Act saw a system of government inspection, auditing and regulation for the first time. And that legislation obliged counties to organise police forces and to shift the emphasis from prevention of crime to its detection. The Victorian fear of crime, and in particular violent crime, is well documented. And the newly emerging press and access to printing also fuels this fear in both a direct and indirect way. Directly through access to reporting, and indirectly by the publication of broadsheets, which often advertised public executions. We've already referred to the number of changes in capital offences, which by 1841 stood at 11. But the other area which enhanced public perception and the fear of crime is celebrity cases. So you may be familiar with this one from Suffolk. This one is referred to frequently as the Red Barn murder case. In the village of Polstead in Suffolk, two families, the family of the Corder family, who were middle-class tenant farmers, and the Martin family, who are lower down the social hierarchy. The Corders have 6 children, 4 sons and 2 daughters. William Corder, the person who is on trial here, was their 3rd son. Maria Martin was the eldest of Thomas Martin's 4 children, and his wife had died giving birth to the 4th child, and he married to a local woman who was quite a bit younger than his wife, so Maria took on a certain degree of responsibility for children within that family. As a quick synopsis, Thomas, the Corder household, John Corder, dies, leaving his wife in charge of the family farm. 2 of his sons also then die in quick succession of tuberculosis, and the 4th son dies by falling through a frozen pond. So William, who is not particularly interested in the farm, becomes the sole surviving son. He starts a relationship, as you might imagine, with Maria. And Maria and he, in theory, plot to leave the village, to get married, to elope, And that is what Maria's family believe they do. However, William reappears back in the village on regular basis, not with Maria, and eventually the Martin family becomes suspicious of where Maria might be. At some point, William says that she's in the Isle of Wight. That's where she's gone. But Maria's father is very suspicious and goes to the last known place where she has been seen, which is the Red Barn, and finds her body there. It's a really tragic story, but the reason that I using it as an example here is for this. So it becomes one of a number of stories the Victorians really focus on. And the Victorians focus on particularly this type of crime. So this is the trial, a book of the trial, but it is bound in the skin of William Calder. And Staffordshire Pottery make a huge number of, I guess we'd call them mementos. So you can see in the middle the Red Barn, and to one side it is the couple concerned, and it's the magistrate on the right hand side. So there's this huge interest in crime, and particularly high profile crime. The Illustrated Police News is one of the earliest British tabloid newspapers, and it built its reputation around these garish reports and garish illustrations, and it focuses on issues of crime and punishment. Published between 1864 and 1938, the popularity of the Police News was never higher, or its reputation never lower, maybe, than at the period of the Whitechapel murders between 1888 and 1891, in which we are familiar and well known as the period of Jack the Ripper. But the Whitechapel murders are among the most notorious unsolved killings of the modern era, and most responsible reports put the final death toll as may have been higher over that 3-year period. But what that has led to for us today is an interest also in Victorian crime, and the examples on the screen are some of those films on the TV programmes, as well as novels that have used crimes from the Victorian period and dramatised them for the public today. Overwhelmingly, the greatest transition between the 18th and the 19th century is definitely in the area of punishment. As we've already considered, there's a large number of capital offences on the statute books at the end of the 18th century. And the alternatives to this were a range of punishments that you'll be familiar with: corporal punishment, stocks, transportation, and short-term in prison in what are called houses of correction. For those who are interested, the proceedings of the Old Bailey have also been produced online, and you can search, as you can see from this front page, you can search there by place, by number of keywords. And although they're the trials of the Old Bailey, there are a number of trials which relate to other parts of the country where things interact between. The 19th century certainly sees a number of key and fundamental changes to the criminal justice system, including the establishment of police forces, the expansion of state intervention, and a reassessment of the legal system. However, much progress has been made would be a matter of opinion and interpretation. While the landscape of rural England certainly changes over the 200-year period that we're considering, forms of protest used in the 18th century continue to be used in the 19th century and are not necessarily dissimilar to some that we've seen in the 20th century. Threatening letters, arson, targeting of individuals or institutions are all things that we are used to seeing documented and have continued throughout that period. Maybe what does change between the period we've considered is the scale of these processes and the increasing secretive nature of them. You'll note that when we talked about it in the earlier period, people weren't necessarily secretive. A group coming together to break machines was quite well documented, and there were a large number, particularly in the swing riots, who were taken to trial. Often where they were acquitted was due to the fact that you needed other people to corroborate that evidence, and people were very defensive of each other, and therefore having evidence to prove something becomes increasingly difficult. Groups are often motivated to protest, but the record doesn't always allow us to determine whether it's in greater numbers or it's the nature of a historical inquiry that we only have access to certain records. I think that covers most of what I want to say in terms of just the development and changes in crime and punishment in the 18th and 19th century. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let's see if we have any questions. So I wanted to ask, so you mentioned about the Australian digitised records. I was wondering what the website was for that at all, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought you might ask that, and I thought, oh, I'll get that, and I haven't, but I will find it in a second for you. It's the Digital Panopticon is what it's called.
Digital Panopticon.
Panopticon, yeah, it's a type of prison system, Panopticon. But yeah, they've digitized a huge amount of records, including all the hulks that were sent, so details of people who were on those hulks, and also there are some diaries and voyage examples on there as well. It's an amazing resource and freely accessible.
Oh, brilliant. And is it really clear on these records where people were transported from in the UK as well? Can you easily sort of follow people as well?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, so it'll tell you, the records tell you where the trial was. So that would obviously, if you were looking for Norfolk or Suffolk, you probably need to obviously try Norwich. So you'd need to do a little bit more research to find exactly where, as it were.
Right.
But at least it gives you a starting point. And sometimes it will refer to the description, it literally describes them as individuals, but it will also say sometimes the parents of who live at or in. So yeah, you can establish whether there's someone that, either from a family perspective or from a community perspective. That information is really useful.
So you're saying that someone who committed a crime in Lowestoft, they might have gone to court in Norwich, potentially?
Might have gone to court, absolutely. That's how I found the example of our guy with the lace. It was from that website.
So would court cases and criminals have been held in Lowestoft at all, and would the town hall have been used for sort of justice?
Yeah, I'm sure it would have done. Yeah, so you have the different layers of justice or structure. So you've got, depending on the severity of what is undertaken. So you've either got a local court, or you have assizes, which happen less regularly and would be on a slightly larger scale. So it depends what it is, as in what the crime is that you're charged with, and therefore the scale as to where you would be referred to. So
okay. So it's interesting that the Riot Act was not repealed until 1967.
Absolutely.
So did this act have any effect in the 20th century up to the 50s and 60s?
Yes, it's still a piece of legislation. You could still technically read the Riot Act, and that should disperse more than 12 people. How often it's read in the 20th century, that I wouldn't be able to tell you without doing some looking around and reading around the subject. The thing about the Riot Act is you had to read it fully and totally, and if you don't include the line at the bottom, which is God Save the King, where it was originally, then that was not a complete reading of the Riot Act. So on a lot of technicalities, people were able to say, well, actually, you haven't read the Riot Act because you haven't literally said word for word the legislation. So it would be possible to find out how often it was actually read. Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
So it wasn't necessarily a strong piece of legislation then?
No, it was a piece of legislation that could be, I guess it's like in the past, the fear of capital punishment in particular must have been quite a striking, something that we're not familiar with, you know what I mean? So if the thought is you might be subjected to capital punishment, you're possibly going to avoid doing anything too drastic. Or at least if the riot act is read at you, you're not going to wait around to find out whether you're going to be arrested.
No.
I would suggest. Whereas rioting, today, I guess, the punishments are not quite the same, clearly. So whether it has the same effect,
No, see what you mean. So with Lowestoft was sort of so you're talking about press gangs, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So is that the main sort of like, I can't think of what I'm trying to say. So was it a fairly sort of peaceful town, really?
Lowestoft was a fairly peaceful town. Yeah, actually. So you're talking about around about a third of the population is related to fishing directly or indirectly. And the rest of the population, obviously, we're talking about Lowestoft as it's defined, thinking of the difference as it's defined today, as opposed to how you define it when it was a much smaller place, obviously, in the 18th century. So the agricultural is important to what we would think of now as Lowestoft, but obviously Lowestoft itself is a much smaller place then. But yeah, so fishing is important, and obviously press gangs would be a quite important part or concern, I guess, in the 18th and early 19th century. But yeah, I think on the whole, Lowestoft was actually, I couldn't find any examples of it specifically rioting. Even food riots, I couldn't find a specific example. There's those that occur around it, and North Cove and those parts that are immediately around Lowestoft. But I think on the whole, yeah, Lowestoft was quite well behaved. The guy who was transported for stealing lace, although he was from Lowestoft, was actually born in Scotland. So he obviously had come down the East Coast as part of his, as a mariner, part of his work. So he wasn't local in the context of being born in Lowestoft.
You'd think, I know Lowestoft would have been more rural back then, but you would have think more comparatively urban environments would be more sort of.
Yeah, maybe it had the good balance. Maybe it wasn't quite urban enough, as in hadn't got maybe quite the pressure on its resources that somewhere slightly bigger had, but more like a large town, maybe, so had access to food and its environment, but not so much that it had pressure from poor sanitation or the other things that you might associate with an urban environment. But I think that depends on exactly what point in time you're going to pick.
Right. I can see someone's typing a question, so we'll see. We'll give it a minute or two, I think.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I'm curious to know. I'm curious. I'm always curious to hear people's questions.
I'm sure people in Lowestoft were just as interested in those celebrity crimes, though, and there were a few of those in Norwich, so they wouldn't have been that far away and accessible. Obviously, when the railway comes,
Sure.
They were quite popular events, I think was the best way to phrase them, actually.
So I might as well put the link to the next talk, which is at the end of April.
Should I unshare my screen?
No, that's fine. That's fine. Thank you. Yeah, so I've just put a link in the chat. So yeah, and we'll email out a questionnaire as well. So I'm not sure what this question's referring to, but Holmes has said blind house use. I'm not sure really what. I think yeah.
Yeah.
So Holmes is asking about blind houses to hold prisoners.
Yeah. So obviously there are a number of there were a number of well, they are lockups. We call them lockups, I suppose. So many towns, actually even large villages, would have had a lockup somewhere where they could keep someone. Which is why I said at the end there, sometimes it's just a very local thing. Um, uh, Stocks or actual corporal punishment. But yeah, so using buildings or establishments that have the facilities to lock someone up, um, places that are institutionalized, is that the best way to call them? Yeah, they could have been used to house prisoners. Yeah, I think unfortunately distinctions weren't necessarily made about somebody who is tried or somebody who's caught and tried about any particular incapacity, mental health, those sorts of things. They're not particularly sympathetic. You are literally going to be tried. I think I tried to say, trials are very quick. They don't spend a lot of time gathering evidence. They're really quick. So yes, you do need to have people locked up, but they'll make the decision quite quickly on what's going to happen next to somebody as an individual. Yeah. And the hulks, when you're transported, you can be taken down to Portsmouth and be on a hulk for 3 or 4 months before they leave. We're not talking about things that go quickly, but as far as obviously they would be concerned in this area, as far as they're concerned, they've gone. They're on a hulk sitting somewhere waiting to be transported. You didn't have to have them locked up yourself until it's ready to go. Some people sat on them for months in quite horrid conditions. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's all the questions now. I think we have someone typing another question. So
That's fine.
yeah.